Look, thanks for the invitation. This is really like homecoming. I was at the very first Paccoa meeting at Parramatta in 1998, and I've not been able to get to all of them, but I think this is probably the 6th or 7th I've managed, so it's kind of like being amongst family. And although a lot of the family members are changing, it's kind of reassuring to see that there's still some of those family members that I've known from way back when. And so what I wanted to talk about today, and by the way, what you see on here may or may not bear any relationship to what I say, because I, I do tend to divert a bit, but also I kind of figured that if the words got too boring, you've got some wallpaper there to concentrate on instead. So let's try that. So before we go up to the first slide there, just it occurred to me that when we talk about working together, a lot of you are at the pit face. You're trying to make a difference. You're committed, you're passionate, you believe in what you're doing. And so the lens through which you see the world is a practice lens, and you'd like to know how you can make a real difference. That's what you want to do. You believe in community, you believe in collaboration. I thought I'd step back from that a bit and then perhaps introduce you to a world that some of you don't see so regularly, which is really what working together, it's not about how do we work together, but what are the kind of things in the next few years we might have to turn our mind together to thinking about what it is we're going to have to work together on. Because I think the world's changing in ways that many of you, because you've been so ensconced in your work, haven't yet perhaps begun to appreciate that around us. I wouldn't say it's necessarily an engulfing tide of change, but it might not be too melodramatic to call it that. And if it is too melodramatic to call it that, that's what I'll probably call it anyway. Okay, so let's just see if... Okay, so I think everyone knows, everyone's working hard and working well. Sometimes you figure if only the people who made the policy understood what it was like for you guys, they could actually make it a whole lot better instead of making it a whole lot harder. And so when I was in Victoria, at one point we had a CEO called Paul Delphine, and Paul was very much into business improvement and modelling business improvement, and he had this system called PDRI, plan, do, review, improve. And everyone, you know, it's like the American phrase, when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's kind of a bit difficult to remember that you've got to spend some time working out how to drain the swamp. And PDRI just became known as Paul Delphine's ridiculous idea. And essentially what that says to me is there's kind of a disconnect between the people who see the world from the top of the pyramid and the people on whose shoulders the pyramid is being supported, which is you guys. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is some of the kind of challenges that I think are going to be very significant for you. Once or twice you might find that my perception of this is not how it turns out to be. The good thing about correctional cycles, as we know, it's often 10 or 15 years before you get good enough data to measure. And by that time, you can think of me what you will, because I won't be around to bear the brunt of it. So here we go. So I'm suggesting that there's a whole lot of, perhaps not quite brave new worlds. That's just an Aldous Huxley phrase, I suppose, that I liked. So let's just strap our seatbelts on, if you like, and let's start to look at what we might mean by... There we go. Okay. If there's a brave new world, or if there's a change world, or if there's a challenging world, what's going to be in it? And what's it going to mean for you guys? One of the things I think we really have to begin to consider is what would happen if the whole world of community corrections was privatised. Now you might say that's bizarre and that's so far off the radar that it makes no sense. Let me tell you it's happening. And it may work. And what we know always is that politicians and backroom advisors watch what goes on elsewhere, and if there's somebody's ridiculous idea, there's somebody currently thinking that what's happening in the UK could, might or should happen here. So let's just explore that for a minute. In March of this year, the UK Offender Rehabilitation Act took effect. That has a number of provisions, but a really significant one, and this Act has now, as I said, been in effect since March, and it developed a concept which is called transforming rehabilitation, and you can find that on the UK Justice website, and I'd invite you to have a look at that, because a lot of what's in there is really quite dramatic and quite far-reaching and quite outside the experience of, I would suggest, anyone in this room, self-included, even though I joined probation just slightly after the first fleet arrived. Okay, so one of the things that they decreed in transforming rehabilitation was that, in fact, effectively all of the supervision of medium and low risk offenders in the United Kingdom, with some limited exceptions, will be privatised. The National Probation Service will be left to handle those 30% or so of high risk cases or other special risk or needs matters which are outside the scope for transfer. But essentially what they've gone out into the marketplace and said is, look, we're going to create 21 regions, and within those 21 regions, services will be open up for bidders. They may be private companies, they may be consortia of not-for-profits and profit. And when I looked on the website 6 weeks ago, there were currently about 30 consortia, big names, big companies, well known, out there in the marketplace saying, yes please, we'd like a slice of some of that action. And so at the present moment, I'm not yet aware, but somebody who in the room who might be is welcome to correct me on this, but what we're expecting to see imminently is that contractual arrangements will be made nationally for the privatised management of about 70% of all UK community-based offenders. Now, does it mean it's going to happen here? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But if we're looking ahead, and probation officers and community corrections officers in this audience would not be here if they're not intent on thinking, looking ahead, and looking ahead, we would have to say it would be very wise to keep an eye on that development. So, at the present moment, we don't actually know what that's going to look like. But one of the things I'd come back to shortly also is a notion that privatisation will bring with it something else which is entirely unexampled in our known history, and that is that those private companies will only get paid according to the results they deliver. They won't get simply paid because they've taken on the contract. So to be paid, you need to deliver against the targets, whatever they happen to be, and against whoever happens to set them. And the problem with that's going to be, obviously, well, first of all, it's going to be an interesting question to see if the targets are meaningful and measurable and make any great sense. The second thing is going to see whether the companies that bid for this are going to be able to meet the targets. But clearly there's a lot of people out there in the marketplace who say, yep, we can do this, we want a slice of that action, there's money to be made, we can do it profitably. And so if a Conservative government in the United Kingdom is minded to do that, why would we not be minded to think about the same thing in Australia? It's not very long ago that the majority of states in this country, and I think at one point all states, had, if you like, progressive or slightly left of centre or centrist governments. Now we have a domination of Conservative governments across the whole country, who very much would be in tune with the kind of thinking that's prevailing in the United Kingdom. So these are some of the questions, but basically I would say to Paccoa, is this a problem in Australia? Will it become a problem? I don't know. But it's an issue you need to keep on the radar. And I think one of the great things about having this collective of brains and thinking in the audience here is that you've got ways of developing the networks to think about, well, it's not only the work we do today and how we do it today that matters, it's the work we're going to do in 5 years' time and what that's going to do to the look of the community, the needs of the community, the safety of the community, and we really need to have a way to work out how to craft our place to be part of that action. So, look, that's it's not meant to be a doom and gloom scenario, it's just meant to say there are some big things happening. I was in Jersey in the Channel Islands recently, and I went to a historic site, and there was a gentleman dressed up in an 18th century military uniform with a tricorn hat and a musket, and he kept, as he walked us around the place, saying, "We're all bound for doom, I tell you." What are we bound for? Silence. We're bound for doom. Say it. So we're not bound for doom, but if it sounds a bit doom-laden, ultimately it's not meant to be that at all. Have a think about it anyway. Can you influence that agenda? If there was an agenda, how would you influence it? And I've got some ideas about that, but that's really a Paccoa issue. I'm now part of what's called the used to be generation. I'm no longer part of the now generation, but this is something which you people I'd invite you to wrestle with. The second thing, which is not unrelated to this, here we go, is that, sorry, we might have skipped one too many. Here we are, this is it. We have now increasing interest in something variously, this is a bit like Heinz 57 varieties of soup. They're either called social investment bonds, social enterprise bonds, social impact bonds, pay for success bonds, call them what you will. But this also betokens a whole new way of thinking about how the world might look in the very near future, and they're things that you guys need to also conjure with. And so the deal here, some of you might know that in 2010 in Peterborough, which is a smallish to middle-sized city, 170,000 people in the United Kingdom, set up a program to look at reducing recidivism rates amongst short-term prisoners discharged from that prison. And the aim was to do that through some kind of private brokerage arrangement. And the social impact bond worked like this. That, so government wants a service, how does it get hold of it? It goes to a social impact, it goes to a social broker. In this case, I think the name of the broker was Social Finance UK. And they say, we want yay service. We want it for nothing. In fact, this is a good deal for government because this is free business if you can do it this way. They said, we want the service and we want it provided privately. And so the social broker goes out into the marketplace and looks for social investment participants who are prepared to stump up dollars. So they put together a pool of dollars, and you'd say to yourself, why the hell would anyone do that? The answer, I don't know, but people do. Expectation of profit, whatever it is. They got 17 investors to put up the required amount of money to, in fact, enable government then to have this contract with a service provider. People have said to me also, why would the service provider get involved? How can they afford to get involved? And the answer is the service provider doesn't have to put up the cash. The service provider has to deliver the service. So, essentially what happens is the service provider has a model or has a program to work with offenders in certain ways, whatever are prescribed, to achieve certain outcomes, in this case reducing recidivism by 7.5% compared to a control group. How well the control group was matched against the experimental group or the pilot group, who can say? But the question then is, you don't achieve the 7.5%, government doesn't pay anything. So, bad luck investors, you go home empty-handed this week. Achieve the 7.5%, you get your money back. Achieve 8%, 9%, 10%, and you get bonuses loaded up to presumably some kind of theoretical ceiling point. So you have to bet the bank that you're going to actually be able to achieve a better result than the government specifies, so you can actually get a positive return on your investment. It all seems a bit like a dumb idea, but for the fact that if you look around the globe now, there are umpteen of these things either happening or in the making. And in the UK, we'll actually never know whether this one's going to work, because they got so far with it, and about 2/3 of the way in, government decided it would fold this program into its broader new transforming rehabilitation program, under which, as I mentioned, all of the privatised probation services will be paid in pretty much the same way. So that program has now been folded into a larger program, and we'll probably never get, I would guess we'll never get data on what that ultimately did. But the thing is, social bonds, impact bonds, enterprise bonds, call them what you will, have begun to take off. New South Wales, I believe, has currently got 2 of them happening, and in a public address, in a public information release from the WA government on the 12th of July, the new Corrective Services Commissioner there, James McMahon, confirmed that he had engaged not-for-profit organisation Social Ventures Australia to assess the feasibility of social benefit bonds already used in the UK, the US, and being trialled in New South Wales. So what we see is that there was a reference on the website also to Department of Treasury in the US inviting bids last year to design programs worth up to $300 million. That begins to start to look like big business. Now, you may say, well, we've got 5 years before we know whether this works. It doesn't seem at the moment as though most other governments who are interested in this are going to wait to 5 years. They're going to pitch on in anyway, and there's lots of evidence that is happening. So what would that mean to you? I don't know quite what it would mean to you, but I think there's certainly issues worth thinking about. The New South Wales government, as one of its 3 pilots, was going to have a social impact or social benefit bond to work with released offenders to reduce rates of recidivism. Those of you from New South Wales might be more up to date with this than I am, but the inside information I have is that that hasn't proceeded up to now. Excuse me, predominant. They've started trialling?
It's not a social venture, it's actually a funding.
Okay, yeah.
It's been reworked.
So they've taken a different pathway.
It was actually looking at going down that track, and the decision was made to do something completely different and go along the line.
Yeah, I had heard that the government wasn't discouraged from the idea of trialling it with private enterprise, simply that when they put it out there, they didn't get sufficient quality bids. Now, whether that's true or not, even if we say that New South Wales has decided to take a slightly different path, look at WA, and we have now clearly a serious interest in that. I am aware, well, I'm not part of the Victorian system anymore, that 2 years ago Social Ventures was in Melbourne talking to the Department of Treasury and talking to the Department of Premier and Cabinet. So clearly there's something going on, or has been something going on behind the scenes. There's been no public announcements. But what that says to me is that there are people in lots of places who are looking at reshaping the world as you guys would know it. And what does that mean? It might mean, in fact, some of you get glorious and glowing private sector careers in future, whether you want them or not, of course. That's the sad bit. But the question then is really, these are things which become part of our landscape and may become part of our world. We are the thinkers of corrections. You guys are. That's what brings you together here. This is why you're motivated to be part of this kind of discussion, enterprise and collaborative think group. So, things to be thinking about. The third thing I think which might impact on you guys, I think this is probably a little less dramatic, but I just want to walk you through a case example from Victoria. One of the things I did after retiring from the department was join the board of an organisation called VACRO, which would be instantly recognisable to people in other states as either the Prisoners Aid and Rehabilitation Society, or in WA it's called Civil Rehabilitation Outcare, and everyone will have a lookalike organisation. So as part of that group, one of the things we've been wrestling with is the fact that government now, VACRO is about 85% dependent on state government funding to run various programs on behalf of the department. And it's just succeeded in winning a lot more programs for post-release and pre-release programs for prisoners. But what seems to be happening, and what was happening in the last year or two, is that as government wanted to extract maximum value for its dollars and put the squeeze on the expenditure, it was reaching a point where many of those small social welfare agencies and not-for-profits no longer could afford to bid for some of the contracts because they operate on such tiny margins. When that happens, they started to look around and say, should we form strategic partnerships with other organisations? Should we amalgamate? Should we do something else, because we can no longer afford to bid for those very programs which are our lifeblood? Now, government doesn't show any sign of relaxing its tentacles in putting that squeeze on, and I would predict that in some cases what's going to happen is that as offender numbers and prisoner numbers grow relentlessly, as they're doing in all states of Australia except for Tasmania. Where are the Tasmanians, by the way? Look, take a bow, you guys. I know the mainland, the trend in the mainland is to say, well, you know, I've seen maps of Australia where Tasmania actually doesn't exist on it, and I'm sure you've had all that sort of stuff. And Tasmania's kind of, it's a bit of an afterthought in most people's attentions. I'd invite you to think about taking Tasmania a bit more seriously at the moment, because it's one of the only places in the country that's got anything really progressive and interesting going on. So feel good about yourselves for that. Go Tas. I'm not being paid by these people, by the way, but I'm a kind of a semi-honorary Tasmanian now. I have a son and a daughter-in-law and 2 lovely grandchildren here, so I spend a lot of time in the state. But the only state to reduce its prison population, and my initial reaction to that was, yeah, well, it's so small that if it drops one year, that's just simply a statistical distortion effect of very low numbers. But the fact that they've been able to sustain it for 3 years, and they've actually got some think work behind what's going to keep that down, suggests that there's some positive thinking here and some positive people, and Bob and his staff ought to be congratulated for that. Let's go back to this anyway. So where's this all leading us? Well, I think one of the problems is going to be that if the numbers continue to grow in prisons, eventually some of the non-governments are going to be forced out of business, because they're just going to say, we can't scale up to meet the demand, we can't reduce price, and they're the only 2 levers they've really got. And I know we've been through this in Paccoa at the moment. We can't really reduce price per unit of service because we're right at the margins anyway. And we can do that to some extent if we operate only as a metropolitan service, but try and spread your service statewide. And people like Carolyn, who comes from a very large state, will know damn well that in a place like WA, which is set over, people in the United States talk about, the great state of Texas, and you tell them that Western Australia is larger than Texas and Alaska combined. You understand the scale of the problem when you're trying to deliver a service nationwide, statewide, on a scale like that with only 2.5 million people to play with. And even in Victoria, where the population density is higher, some people say we've got the densest people in the country, but that's not really quite fair either. Even where the population density is higher, we can't really, in a lot of these small organisations, afford to scale up. And one of the options which is going to be left to government, and it'll be interesting to see if it happens, is they might then say, look, we can't reasonably rely on some of these small not-for-profits to deliver for us anymore. What are we going to do? And one option would have to be to say, we'll recall those services in-house and we'll run them ourselves. That will be really interesting, because getting the specialist skills to do it might be a challenge. But it occurs to me, without being too uncharitable, because I've seen the way the machinations of senior executive minds work, would be to say, well, we just load that work onto the work of existing people, and who are those people? Well, they're community corrections people. They're there, we've got a workforce, we've got a skill set, let's just do it. Now, once again, not a doom-laden speech, but just, that's one of those park in the back of your head kind of things. If those kind of trends on issues started to surface in our state or across the country, or pop up like mushrooms after rain in various parts of the country, what would we do about that? How would we get our act together to try and discuss whether we can meet that challenge? I think one of the ways you can begin to meet some of these challenges is, in fact, through organisations within your own states, which may be a collective of people who have, like in Victoria now, and I think in some other states, there is also now a Smart Justice Collective, which consists of about 40 agencies of various kinds, Jesuits, various academic organisations, bodies like VACRA, which I'm part of. And so together they have the opportunity to at least exercise a little bit more political influence than small groups like Paccoa, which are probably seen in many cases as being rather down the food chain. People are aware of them, they're grateful for what they do, but when it really comes to making hard policy decisions, how much count do you have? Not sure, but I mean, there must be other ways that you could consider using the skills and the knowledge and the talents and the experience you have in the room to try and meet that sort of challenge. I won't go on for too much longer. The fourth thing is really, in some ways, it's not directly a community correctional problem, but it becomes a community correctional problem, and this is this whole insatiable prison growth culture mentality. We haven't done it on anything like the scale of the United States. when I looked in 2010, and they were figures from there's a website called World Prison Brief. It's a fascinating website because it gives you if you can't find it under that name, it's now linked to the University of Essex. It used to be affiliated, I think, with University College London, but it's now part of the associated with the University of Essex, and they publish statistics on crime rates and imprisonment for every country in the world, and you can watch the trend lines. And the last time I looked at the United States, I mean, they were so comfortably the world champion in this that there wasn't any real debate, you know. So it was United States gold, silver, and bronze, and then open space, and then the Russians came in at about place number 15. Mr. Putin, of course, they've sorted out reoffending rates quite well in Russia in a variety of different ways. The newest one, which is probably the least savoury one of all, is if you go to prison for a long time in Russia, one of the likeliest things to happen to you is that you'll contract treatment-resistant strains of TB and you'll die there. Now, it's an effective anti-recidivism measure, but it's not particularly humanitarian. So we won't talk about the Russians. Let's talk about somebody else. Let's talk about Australia, why not, we're here. Okay, so what's happening in Australia is that in 2012-13, every state except Tasmania recorded growth in its prison rates. By United States, we're minnows standards. We have a national rate now of 130 some per 100,000. The latest figure, I think, might go slightly higher than that, but as some of you will know, that the report on government services is published in January of each year, and you can pick up the year's figures for the preceding financial year, June, from about 29 January. So you can check these numbers. The trend started a bit later here than they did in the United States, but for the last 20 years, almost relentlessly, with a few minor exceptions, the trend has been upwards. And that's been very much the experience in Victoria. One of the reasons I went to Victoria was Victoria historically had an aversion to punishing or locking people up if they didn't think it was absolutely necessary. And for many years, leaving aside the ACT, which didn't have a prison until 2007-8, Victoria had by far the lowest rates of imprisonment in the country. And we used to like to have New South Wales next door to us, because they made us look so good without trying very hard. How did they do that? Well, they had twice as many people in jail for 30% more people. They had a recidivism rate which was substantially higher than ours, and they had a crime rate which was higher. And yet you had Ronnie Woodham's up there, God bless him, in New South Wales saying, just give me money to build you more prisons and I'll make this community safer. And in fact, if you looked at the metrics, none of it happened. And so the great thing about Victoria in 2001, which sadly is now consigned to the pages of history, was that they had a reformist agenda which said, what can we do to drive our prison numbers down? At that stage, there were only 3,000 prisoners in the state. Reasonable by most standards, certainly by most United States local state standards, particularly when you looked at California when I was there in 94, had 100,000 prisoners on 35 million population. By 98 it was 170,000 prisoners, and it might have been coincidental, but it always struck me, it was interesting, that the exact amount of additional money they needed to fund and feed the prison system was exactly the amount of money they docked off the education vote. And that might be coincidence, but you'd have to say, well, they had to fund those beds somehow. And what would you say if people are socially excluded because all the good life options aren't available to them, education, employment, secure housing, secure relationships, so on and so forth, what happens? The very kind of thing that might give you some hope of reducing that further spiralling up, you pull that out, and so effectively the system feeds off itself. Now, in Victoria, they got a circuit breaker and they strengthened up community corrections. We got our prison numbers down for 200 or 300, but then in late 2006 something happened which was rather sad, which was there were a small number of serious sex offenders about to be released having served their full sentence, and the community was very nervous about that, so we brought in this response, the extended supervision order for serious sex offenders. that legislation, it was the fastest legislation through the Parliament, I think, probably ever since any legislation except the vote to increase parliamentary salaries. You know, that always goes through on the voices. You know, there's never even a petition. You know, they just go, yeah, we'll do that. So the sad part about that was, while those were nasty people and while they were threatening people, behind all that was some things that happened which you'd say, if you're a thinking person, represented the erosion of some significant parts of due process and fair and just processes of justice, which are bulwarks of the way we believe and the way we've seen our world for many centuries, and with good reason. And as part of that, as part of the protection that the community was being offered for that, it started to change the mentality that, in fact, if there are people nasty around here, the way we deal with it is we just lock them up more and more and more of them. And so over the last 7 or 8 years, what we've seen in Victoria, that was the beginning. But then the government said, the current government said, if we come to power, we'll get rid of Home D because it's not a tough sentence. We'll get rid of all suspended sentences. We'll get rid of a lot of the bail provisions and bail presumptions for people facing charges. We'll make parole much tougher. And so we now have 50% more people in the jail, and the jail population in Victoria is currently growing by about 20 per week. And what have we got for all that would be the question. And what's this mean for community corrections? Well, essentially, the government is about to go up for re-election, and it'll be interesting to see what happens, on a platform of, we'll make sure that the people who are the greatest threat to this community are locked up. I'm getting the message, wrap it up. Is that 5 or 10 or just shut up? Okay, so essentially, but 75% of those people are actually doing short sentences now, and 75% were before. So nothing's much changed. But what this all basically means is that if those people are going to be plonked in a prison in larger and larger numbers, eventually they have to emerge again. And that becomes then a significant issue. And how do we deal with that? How do we plan for that? What are the other alternative options we've got? And one of the things which, this is the very last comment, transforming rehabilitation in the UK, the other little sting in the tail is now they're proposing that because of short-term sentence prisoners are amongst the highest recidivism rates, they will now propose to manage all post-release short sentence prisoners doing less than 12 months. Once again, I don't know quite how they're going to plan to do that, but even if they transfer most of those into the private sector, presumably some of those will remain in the public sector. And that also means that coming in your direction might be a whole new cohort of people. Are they coming? I don't know. All they said I started out to do today, apart from scaring the pants off you, was to say, look, these are the kinds of things which I think thoughtful people such as you are need to be conjuring with over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Do I believe you can do it? Do I believe you can make a difference? There's an interesting phrase which I don't know whose phrase it was, but when other people use other people's phrases, it's called plagiarism. When I do it, it's called research. So here's some research. Somebody once said, never imagine that committed individuals cannot make a difference. It's the only thing that ever has. You're the committed individuals. Over to you. Cheers.